Millions of people are doing exactly what a stable society asks them to do. They work hard, they stay disciplined, they try to save, they delay gratification, and yet the stable life they were promised keeps moving further out of reach. In many major cities now, a typical home no longer costs 3 years of income. It can cost 5, 10, even far more. So maybe this is not just a housing problem. Maybe this is what it looks like when hard work no longer buys the life it used to. That is the part I keep coming back to. Because when people feel financially stuck, we usually tell the story in a way that makes it sound personal. Maybe they are not budgeting well enough. Maybe they started too late. Maybe they chose the wrong city, the wrong career, the wrong timing. But the more I look at what has happened over the last few decades, the harder it is to believe this is mainly a story about individual failure. For a long time, home prices and incomes still moved in something closer to balance. That balance is gone. It looks much more like a story about a broken relationship between effort and stability. And nowhere does that rupture show itself more clearly than housing. Not because housing is the only thing getting harder. It is not. Education, childcare, healthcare, transportation, and retirement have all become heavier in different ways. But housing is different because it used to sit at the center of a certain life script. It was the milestone that made the rest of adulthood feel real. You got steady work, built some savings, and eventually moved into a place that gave your life a sense of permanence. It was not just a purchase. It was proof that your effort connected to something solid.
Homeownership once turned discipline into security. Today, that promise feels weaker than ever.
People stop believing they will ever own a home. They are not just giving up on a purchase. They are giving up on a sequence that used to give adult life its shape. For a long time, that sequence felt clear. You worked, stayed responsible, saved what you could, and slowly moved toward stability. A home was not just a financial goal at the end of that process. It was the proof that sacrifice in the present could still create security in the future. It turned effort into permanence. That is why housing carries so much more emotional weight than people often admit. When homeownership drifts out of reach, what disappears is not only access to property. It is the sense that ordinary people can still enter a stable adult life through discipline and patience. The old promise was never that everyone would become rich. It was that responsible behavior could still build something solid. But for a growing number of households, even monthly housing costs now consume so much income that ownership no longer feels like a delayed goal. It feels like a fading one. Once that promise starts breaking, the damage spreads far beyond housing. People do not experience a home only as shelter or as an investment. They experience it as proof that their work connects to something lasting. That is why losing faith in ownership hits so deeply. It makes people question whether the economy still rewards patience the way it once claimed to. This is especially heavy for the middle class, because the middle class is not held together only by income. It is held together by expectation, by the belief that if you act responsibly, delay gratification, and keep moving carefully, you will reach certain milestones over time. Homeownership has long been one of the clearest of those milestones. That is why the issue is no longer just that homes are expensive. It is that ownership now feels disconnected from the behaviors that are supposed to make it possible. People can be educated, employed, and financially cautious, yet still feel that ownership belongs to a different category of life, one reserved for those who bought earlier, inherited help, or already had capital behind them. At that point, housing stops feeling like a difficult goal and starts feeling like a sorting system. And that is why I do not think this is just a story about affordability. It is a story about belief, about what happens when a society keeps telling people that stability is still available while quietly reorganizing the economy so that stability depends more and more on existing ownership.
When stability depends on ownership first, hard work starts losing its power to lift people.
I think the first mistake people make is assuming this happened because the world suddenly ran out of homes. That is too simple. The deeper problem is that the economy changed what homes were for. At one point, housing was mostly part of the social world. It was where people lived, raised families, built routines, and anchored their future. It had financial value, of course, but that value was attached to use. Over time, that changed. Homes became less important as places to live and more important as containers for wealth. And once that shift happened, the logic of the market changed with it. When something essential becomes a financial asset, demand starts coming from two very different places at once. One group needs the thing because they intend to use it. The other wants the thing because it stores value, protects wealth, creates income, or appreciates over time. Those two groups do not enter the market with the same motivations, the same flexibility, or the same power. One is trying to secure a normal life. The other is trying to position capital. That distinction matters much more than people realize. Think about what happens in a world where safer forms of long-term security feel harder to find. Pensions become less certain. Returns on savings stay weak for years. Public systems feel thinner. Retirement becomes more individual and less collective. In that kind of environment, ownership starts carrying more psychological weight. Property is no longer just a major purchase. It begins to feel like one of the few remaining defenses against uncertainty. And once enough people start thinking that way, housing prices stop being shaped mainly by shelter demand and start being shaped by fear, wealth preservation, and the expectation of future scarcity. That is when the market stops acting like a place where ordinary incomes buy ordinary homes and starts acting more like a sorting machine. People with existing assets can use those assets to gain access to more assets. People without them are left trying to catch a moving target using wages alone. And wages, almost everywhere, are slower than compounding asset prices. That is the core break.
Once homes compete with capital, ordinary buyers stop entering a market and start losing to one.
And once you see that break clearly, the next question becomes unavoidable. How did prices get so far away from the incomes that were supposed to support them? No single decision broke this market. There was no one law, no one villain, no one moment when everything snapped. It was a chain of incentives, each one pushing in the same direction, until shelter slowly drifted out of reach for the people it was meant to serve. The first part of that chain was supply. In many cities, building homes became slower, harder, and more politically fragile over time. A lot of restrictions began with goals that sounded reasonable on their own: protect green space, limit sprawl, preserve neighborhood character, reduce congestion. But over time, those goals hardened into zoning rules, height caps, parking minimums, and approval systems so slow and so complex that building stopped being a normal response to need. And that changed the logic of the market. In a healthier system, higher prices should trigger more construction, which should eventually ease the pressure. But when land use is tightly controlled and development is constantly delayed, rising prices do not create enough new supply. They simply make existing homes more valuable. Scarcity stops being temporary and starts being built into the system itself. Then cheap money poured fuel on top of that scarcity. For years, interest rates stayed low and global liquidity remained abundant. Borrowing was easy, capital was restless, and investors needed somewhere safe to put money. Housing fit that need almost perfectly. It was tangible, rentable, borrowable against, and widely trusted. So the same homes that were already hard to build became magnets for capital. Supply was constrained, and money was aggressive. That combination was never going to end well. At the same time, wages were failing to keep pace. For much of the 20th century, incomes and home prices still moved in some kind of relationship to each other. Not perfectly, but closely enough that ordinary work could still support ordinary stability. Over the last few decades, that relationship weakened. Globalization, automation, offshoring, and broader labor market shifts put pressure on middle-income wage growth, even as asset values accelerated. So people kept working, kept saving, kept trying to be responsible, while the thing they were trying to buy moved further away. And that changes more than budgets. It changes how effort feels. If home prices rise a little faster than wages, life gets harder. But when prices double, triple, or quadruple while incomes barely move, people stop feeling merely pressured and start feeling locked out. The problem is no longer that the ladder is steep. It is that the ladder is being pulled upward as they climb. Then there is another force people often misunderstand: dual income households. In theory, two incomes should have made housing more affordable, but markets adjust, sellers adjust, lenders adjust. Once two incomes became common, the market absorbed that added capacity. Homes were no longer priced around what one stable income could support. They were priced around what two incomes could stretch to carry. And stretch they did. As prices rose beyond pay, debt filled the gap. Buyers borrowed more because they had to. Banks lent more because rising prices made housing look safe. Bigger mortgages allowed higher bids pushed prices up, and higher prices then seemed to justify even larger loans. Credit expansion and price appreciation started feeding each other. The market looked healthy precisely because it was inflating. That is one of the most dangerous money patterns in any economy. Rising prices create the illusion of safety. Safety attracts more credit, and more credit drives prices even higher. From the outside, it can look like strength. Underneath, it is dependency. Then the pandemic exposed how brittle the whole structure had become. Construction costs surged, supply chains broke, labor shortages delayed projects. Later, interest rates rose sharply, which should have cooled the market more forcefully. But another distortion locked in. Millions of homeowners were sitting on ultra-low-rate mortgages and had no incentive to sell. So listings dried up, supply froze, and the shortage remained. Governments tried to help, but many responses focused on helping people afford the shortage rather than fixing the shortage itself. Grants, subsidies, and tax breaks sound supportive, but in a supply-constrained market, they often just give buyers more money to fight over the same limited number of homes. That does not restore affordability. It intensifies the bidding war. So when I trace this crisis honestly, I do not see a mystery. I see restricted land, rigid subcapital, weak wage growth, rising leverage, and short-term policies that treated symptoms instead of causes. That is how homes became impossibly expensive. Not by accident, but through a long sequence of incentives that rewarded scarcity, debt, and ownership far more than affordability. This is one of the most overlooked consequences of housing inflation. It changes not just what people buy, but what kind of life feels available to them. A delayed purchase does not sound dramatic on paper, but in real life, delay compounds. People postpone having children until they feel settled, then discover settlement is expensive. They stay in jobs they do not love because moving feels too risky. They choose relationships with financial logic in mind. They live farther from work, farther from family, farther from community, because proximity has become a premium good. The cost of housing starts reorganizing everything else. And then there is the psychological effect, which I think is even more important than most economic commentary admits. People can tolerate sacrifice when sacrifice feels meaningful. What wears them down is the sense that responsibility is no longer enough, that they are being asked to behave prudently in a system that increasingly rewards timing over discipline, ownership over effort, and financial position over social contribution. That is why this issue lands so hard with younger adults and middle-income households. It is not simply that they want homes. It is that they want proof that adult life still has a structure they can enter. They want to know that if they make reasonable choices, stability is still possible. When housing drifts too far from income, what collapses is not just a purchasing relationship. It is a moral relationship, the one between effort and outcome. And the wider economy pays for that too. When teachers, nurses, service workers, tradespeople, and younger professionals cannot afford to live in the cities they keep running, those cities start hollowing out. A locked housing market becomes a locked labor market. The places with the most opportunity lose the very workers that make opportunity possible. Mobility slows, productivity weakens, innovation spreads less efficiently, and all the while, inequality deepens. Because the gains are not distributed evenly. Existing homeowners benefit from scarcity. Their wealth rises as prices rise, often without any corresponding increase in productive contribution. Renters, meanwhile, hand over larger shares of their income just to remain housed. First-time buyers take on more debt later in life, under worse conditions than the generations before them. The latter still exists, but it is being pulled further upward as people try to climb it. So if I step back and look at the pattern clearly, this is what I see. Housing did not become unreachable because one generation suddenly became less disciplined or more entitled. It became unreachable because modern economies allowed a basic need to become deeply entangled with wealth storage, scarcity protection, cheap leverage, and political incentives that favor existing owners over future entrants. And once that happened, the market stopped asking a simple question like, can ordinary people afford to live here? It started asking a much harsher one. How much pressure can people absorb before they finally give up? That, to me, is the real story. Not that houses got expensive, but that stability itself became more conditional, more delayed, more dependent on existing capital, more difficult to secure through work alone, which means the real cost of the housing crisis is not only financial. It is social, emotional, and generational. When people stop believing they can build a stable life through ordinary effort, they change. They become more anxious, more cynical, more short-term, more cautious about commitment, and less willing to trust the future. Saving feels different in a world where the goal keeps receding. Ambition feels different in a world where ownership seems reserved for those who are already inside. Even hope begins to behave differently. That is why I do not think this story ends with housing. Housing is just the clearest lens. Because once an economy starts separating contribution from security, the consequences spread everywhere, into family formation, into labor mobility, into retirement anxiety, into class identity, into the way people imagine adulthood itself. And if we actually want to fix that, then building more homes, while necessary, is only part of the answer. The deeper question is whether housing is still meant to function primarily as shelter, or whether we have quietly accepted a system where it serves capital first and ordinary life second. Because until that question is answered honestly, the same pattern will keep repeating. People will keep working, they will keep saving, they will keep trying to do everything right, and stability will keep moving further away. If this video made you think, subscribe to Money Patterns and stay with me because the deeper pattern is only beginning to reveal itself.